The signal hit my scanner before the ship even finished decelerating out of faster-than-light travel. Not a weapon, not a targeting system, a transmission on old-band radio frequency, the kind of thing Dominion scanners typically filter out as background noise from developing worlds. The autofilter almost caught it, almost. What stopped it was a mathematical sequence embedded inside the broadcast, a pattern that had no business existing inside unscheduled output from a species that was not supposed to know anyone was listening. The sequence was a greeting, not directed at us, directed at anyone who might be passing by. They had been broadcasting it on a rotating frequency array for 43 of their years. My name is Veth Karal, and that transmission was the first thing humanity ever said to me, and I wish I had understood it before I filed my first report. The briefing had lasted 11 minutes. I counted them because counting things is what I do when I am trying to stay calm, and walking into a mission briefing has always produced in me a specific variety of anxiety that requires counting. The assessment officer had a name that translated into something like Coordinator of Routine Matters, which told you everything about how the Dominion classified this particular assignment. He moved through his slides with the brisk efficiency of someone who had already written the conclusion before reviewing the evidence. I was 22 cycles old, the youngest scout on the Earth observation rotation, which was less a distinction and more an explanation of why I was sitting in a folding chair at the back of a briefing room while veterans with real assignments filed out around me. The Earth posting was what you got when you were new, when the roster needed filling, when someone had to go watch a species that the consensus had already decided was not going to be interesting. 6-page summary in my intake folder. I had written more detailed reports about atmospheric anomalies on uninhabited moons. I was not bitter about this. Reconnaissance work does not demand courage. It demands patience, careful observation, and the ability to stay invisible while other things happen around you. I had been practicing those exact skills for most of my life, not as professional training, but as a natural response to being an organism that has always found watching far safer than participating. Earth seemed like a reasonable place to practice watching. The briefing covered the standard framework: third planetary body in a stable orbit around a mid-sequence star, single dominant species, bipedal, warm-blooded, atmospheric dependent, no faster-than-light technology, no collective intelligence network, no orbital weapons of meaningful yield, internal conflict between territorial factions documented and classified as self-limiting behavior, meaning the species was, in the Dominion's considered opinion, more likely to exhaust itself than to present any organized challenge to external contact. Projected timeline for voluntary compliance after first contact, 4 to 7 standard cycles. The assessment officer closed his folder and said, "They will be manageable." I wrote the word manageable in my field notes. I circled it without fully understanding why I was doing it. Looking back, I think the smarter part of my processing recognized something that the rest of me had not yet caught up to, something in the way the word sat on the page, too comfortable, too certain, the word of someone who had decided before looking. My observation vessel was a single-occupancy scout ship, near invisible to any sensor array within the species' technological range. From low orbit, I could intercept all active transmissions, map population centers, track military movements, and monitor atmospheric and geological data in real time. What I could not do from that altitude was understand the weight of what I was actually looking at. The first 4 days of observation produced clean, organized data. I was thorough. I compiled everything into a preliminary threat assessment that I transmitted to the fleet coordinator and that I am now genuinely ashamed of having sent. I described their communication networks as disorganized. I described their military positioning as inconsistent with any coherent defensive strategy. I described their social behavior as emotionally volatile, and I categorized that volatility as a disadvantage. Every single observation was accurate. Not one of them was correct. On day 5, I began paying closer attention to the transmission intercepts. This was when I first noticed that their broadcast channels did not operate the way I had assumed. A military coordination frequency would carry, hours later, a recording of someone performing music. A civil emergency network would contain, embedded between alert protocols, a personal message from one named individual to another individual who was apparently far away. The channels were layered the way sedimentary rock is layered, each thing built directly on the previous thing, nothing separated, because separation was apparently not a concept they applied to communication. My translator flagged 37 words across 6 languages for which no Dominion equivalent existed. These were not technical terms. They were not navigational or scientific or operational terms. They were words for specific interior states, specific qualities of feeling that the Dominion linguistic database simply did not contain. Not because the translators had failed to find equivalents, because the Dominion had, over 3 centuries of refinement, removed the states of experience that would have required those words. I marked the flag as a translation anomaly and continued building my report. On day 6, I watched a coastal city for 6 consecutive hours, trying to establish population movement patterns. The patterns would not resolve into anything I could model. People moved with purposes I often could not identify. They stopped in the middle of established routes to speak to each other about things unrelated to where they were going. One individual stood in the center of a wide pedestrian street and simply looked up at the sky for 40 seconds, making no communication, performing no visible task, and then walked on as if this interlude had not happened. Behavioral anomaly. Filed. Moved on. The threat assessment I transmitted on day 7 rated the species as low concern. I used the word manageable twice. I believe, looking at it now, that I was performing the conclusion the briefing had already supplied, fitting my observations into the shape I had been told the shape would be. Day 11 changed things. I intercepted a transmission moving between 2 military facilities on opposite sides of the largest ocean on the planet. The encryption was not technically advanced, but it was creative in a way that slowed my decoder more than I had expected from a species I had rated as having poor communication discipline. Creative was the word I kept returning to. Not strong. Creative. When it finished decoding, the content was a logistics document, supply line assessments, fuel reserves by region, personnel distribution schedules, equipment inventories by category and geographic location. Every piece of it organized with a precision and detail that was completely inconsistent with anything else I had observed from this species. At the top of the document was a creation date stamp, 14 months prior. They had started this file 14 months ago. I sat in my observation chair and did not write anything for a long time. Outside the viewport, the planet rotated slowly, blue and white and green, looking exactly like the briefing slides, looking exactly like something that did not know we were coming. Except they knew. They had known for 14 months. And in those 14 months they had not transmitted distress signals or surrender requests on frequencies they would not even know to scan for. They had not attempted mass evacuations that would offer no real protection. They had not collapsed into the internal chaos the behavioral models predicted for a pre-interstellar species under this kind of pressure. They had not done any of the things that the Dominion's extensive database of first contact scenarios said they would do. They had filed logistics reports. They had counted their fuel. They had cataloged their equipment. They had moved their people. They had done, with the quiet and methodical efficiency of a group that has already made the hard decision and is now past the point of reconsidering it, exactly what you do when the question of whether to act has been resolved and only the question of how remains. I opened a blank document on my datapad. I looked at the empty page. There was something happening behind my processing that I did not have a clean name for. A resistance. Not to writing the report exactly, but to writing the specific sentence that the data in front of me was clearly trying to become. My species had removed the physiological fear response from our biology 3 centuries ago. The reasoning was sound, and the research was thorough, and the results across multiple generations of data confirmed the decision was correct. Fear impedes processing speed. Fear produces hesitation at moments when hesitation is most costly. Fear is an evolutionary holdover, preserved by biological inertia past the point of functional usefulness. Remove it. We removed it. I looked at the blank page and felt the pressure of something nameless, and did not move my hands and did not write a single word for several minutes. I requested an additional observation period before the fleet's scheduled arrival. The extension was approved without discussion. The fleet did not recalibrate its timelines for pre-interstellar targets. I spent the extension doing something I had not been doing properly, watching instead of analyzing. Analysis is what you do when you have already decided which framework the data fits. Watching is what you do when you begin to notice that the frameworks you arrived with may not be large enough for what you are looking at. I watched supply vehicles moving through mountain terrain at night, without lights, running in column formation with spacing calculated to minimize their detectability from above. They had thought about orbital observation. They had adapted their movement patterns to account for it. I was conducting orbital observation. I watched defensive positions being established, not at the obvious high ground, but at locations that only made tactical sense if you had thought carefully about the actual mechanics of the coming engagement, rather than the most predictable version of it. They were preparing for the real fight, not the fight the briefing had described. On the night before the fleet arrived, I intercepted a short personal transmission, moving between two people at the same installation, carrying no encryption because the sender apparently did not think the content needed protecting. One voice: "Do you think they understand what is about to happen to us?" Second voice: "No, but we do." A pause that my recorder captured as 4 seconds of open channel. Then, "That is enough." I replayed it 11 times. It was not bravado. It was not the forced optimism of a species trying to talk itself into confidence. It was the level statement of two people who had looked at the situation with clear eyes, found it exactly as difficult as expected, and had decided that honest understanding of the situation was, by itself, sufficient foundation to stand on. That is enough. I named the new document on my datapad. I called it Human Baseline. Entry 1. They have known we were coming for at least 14 months. Their response was to file logistics reports and reposition their resources. They are not behaving like a species that expects to survive this contact. They are behaving like a species that has made its decision and is past the point of revisiting it. I saved the entry. The fleet arrived at first light over the eastern continent, exactly on schedule. 17 cruisers in the formation designed to be seen and understood as overwhelming. The planet below looked up at them, and then humanity used 4 words that my translator rendered as a complete refusal, combined with a highly personal commentary about the character of whoever had made the offer. The battle began. The word manageable sat in my first report, circled, waiting. I was about to understand why I had circled it. The first thing the fleet commander said after the formation settled was, "Minimal engagement expected. We have seen this before." He had seen it before. 16 pacification missions across a career that spanned 4 decades of Dominion expansion, 16 species, 16 contact events, 16 outcomes that matched the projected models within acceptable margins. He was not arrogant about his experience, he was simply calibrated by it, the way a scale becomes calibrated by consistent use. He expected the needle to land where it always landed. The needle did not land where it always landed. 17 cruisers dropped into position above Earth in the standard pacification arc, designed to maximize visibility from the surface. The point of the formation is psychological before it is tactical. You want the target population to look up, understand the scale of what has arrived, and make the rational calculation before the shooting starts. Rational calculation, in the Dominion's extensive experience, almost always produces the same result. I was watching from my observation post, running full sensor sweeps and feeding the data to the fleet command channel. My scanner picked up the human orbital platforms immediately, 6 of them in low orbit, positioned with more deliberate spacing than their original deployment patterns would suggest. My instruments cataloged the hardware additions: improvised rail-based launch systems, surface technology components adapted for zero-gravity operation, power feeds rerouted from their original functions to support the weapons arrays. One platform was still transmitting agricultural research data from instruments that had not been disconnected. They had built a weapons platform and left the plant sensors running. The fleet commander received my data feed and issued a notation to his tactical team. Disregard improvised hardware. Insufficient yield for meaningful engagement. He was correct about the yield calculations. He was not correct about what the yield calculations meant in context. The Dominion sent the standard first contact signal. This transmission had been engineered by linguistic specialists over 2 centuries of refinement, tested against hundreds of known language structures and cultural communication frameworks. Translated into the primary human language, it said, "The force now in your orbital space exceeds your capacity for meaningful resistance. Compliance is the outcome that preserves the most for your species. This offer is available for a limited time." The human response came back in 4 words. My translator marked the response as idiomatic, combining categorical refusal with a statement about the physical capabilities of whoever had sent the offer, anatomically specific in a way that was clearly not intended literally, but was clearly intended insultingly. The fleet opened fire. I watched the engagement data update in real time on my display screens. 3 cruisers disabled in the first 4 minutes. Not destroyed, disabled. Weapons systems offline, propulsion compromised, no longer contributing to the engagement. 3 out of 17 is 16%, which in pure numerical terms is not catastrophic for the fleet as a whole. But 3 cruisers, disabled in 4 minutes, against 6 improvised weapons platforms mounted on agricultural research stations, was not an outcome any model I had been trained on had produced as a first contact scenario. I stopped writing reports. For 43 minutes I only watched. One of the human pilots was transmitting on an open channel while flying a burning aircraft at a rate of descent that my instruments identified as non-survivable. Both of his aircraft's propulsion systems had failed. The structure was on fire across approximately 60% of its surface area. He was maintaining directional control with what appeared to be manual override systems. He kept transmitting. My translator caught the words as they came through. He said, "Tell my wife her husband broke even." His aircraft struck the primary weapons array on one of the cruisers. I sat with the translation for a long time. The idiom was in my database, but I looked it up again anyway. To break even, to complete a transaction or contest with no net gain and no net loss. To end where you began. The pilot had entered this engagement with 1 aircraft, 1 set of skills, and himself. He had nothing else on his personal balance sheet. In the accounting he was conducting in the last moments available to him for any accounting at all, what he was saying was this: "I spent what I had, and what I got in return was fair." The weapons array was gone. He had decided that was fair. I opened the human baseline file. Entry 2. They are not fighting because they believe they will win. The pilot understood his situation precisely. He chose his outcome deliberately. I do not have a framework in my training that classifies this as rational behavior, and I am becoming concerned that the problem is the framework. I added 1 more line. My Day 7 report called this species manageable. I am beginning to think I do not know what that word means. I closed the entry and did not sleep that night. The reassignment came the following morning. Priority designation, ground team deployment. My surface observation data made me useful for close-range documentation, which was the official framing for "you are going down there, and your preferences about this are not relevant." I packed my equipment. Before I boarded the transport, I added Entry 3 to the human baseline file. Entry 3. My biological indicators are reading within normal range. My species removed the fear response from our genome 3 centuries ago through a process that the literature describes as one of our greatest physiological achievements. I am recording here, for accuracy, that my hands are trembling. I looked at that sentence. I left it. I closed the file and got on the transport with both hands occupied so I would not have to look at them. Earth rose toward me as the transport descended, and as the atmosphere thickened around the hull I understood for the first time a word I had found in the Dominion's xenolinguistic archive while searching for a name for the pressure that had been building behind my processing since day 11. The word was in a section labeled Extinct Languages of Formerly Independent Species. The extinct species had used it to describe what their population experienced in the hours before Dominion contact. The word was dread. I had understood it as a definition. Now I understood it as an experience. There is a significant difference between those two things, and the difference is not something that translates well across the gap between them. The transport ramp dropped and the planet came in. The smell was the first thing. The briefing had not mentioned the smell. Nothing in any of the atmospheric analysis data I had collected from orbit had prepared me for what the planet actually smelled like from inside it. There was something burning, low and sustained, not explosive but patient. Underneath that was something green and alive in a way that felt almost aggressive, as if the biology of the place was actively asserting itself at every opportunity. And underneath both of those there was something else. Something the instruments had not captured because it was not a data point but a quality. The smell of a world that was completely and unapologetically in the middle of being alive, conducting its business without reference to anything happening above it. The 40 members of the ground team with me were veterans. They had done this 8 times collectively, and it showed in how they moved, which was with the compact efficiency of people whose bodies had learned not to waste motion on feelings. They were checking their equipment, speaking in low voices about things unrelated to the mission, organizing themselves with a practiced ease that I found simultaneously reassuring and disorienting. I was not a veteran of anything. The city we entered had a name that my translator converted to an approximation meaning something like still morning, which I suspected was imprecise. The streets were quiet, with the specific quality of places that are waiting rather than empty. There is a difference, I was learning, between a space from which people have fled and a space that people have deliberately left and may intend to return to. The city felt like the second kind. Objects had been arranged outside certain doorways before the occupants left. Small things, carefully placed. I photographed each one and added them to the human baseline file without yet knowing what they meant. The team commander was a man named Sorath, who had been on 8 previous contact missions. He reviewed my running documentation files on the second day of ground operations and told me I was using too many words for a standard scout report. I said, "The situation seems to require more words than standard." He said, "The situation always requires fewer words than scouts think. Give me numbers." I gave him numbers. I also kept writing the longer version in a separate document that I did not share with him. By the 3rd day, that document was 38 pages long. On day 2 of the ground operation, we ran into a human unit that my orbital data had placed 6 kilometers to the east. They were not to the east. They were in front of us, in a position covering the 3 most logical approach routes to their location. In a formation that had been reached by crossing a water channel my own sensors had cataloged as impassable for troop movement. They had made it passable by crossing it anyway. At night, on foot. The engagement lasted longer than the numbers said it should. When it was over, I stood at the edge of the water channel, wet from the crossing we had made to clear the position, and I thought about the logistics document stamped 14 months earlier. The channel was referenced in that document, not as an obstacle, as a route. They had been planning to cross it for over a year. Entry 17. They are not improvising. The positioning, the channel crossing, the timing. This was in the planning document I intercepted from orbit 14 months ago. They have been preparing for the specifics of this engagement since before we confirmed we were coming. They have been preparing for something like us for longer than that. I paused. I added one more line. I think they have been preparing for something like us for their entire recorded history, and I think we mistook that preparation for internal conflict. On day 3, we found the school. We were taking shelter in a building that had been used to educate children. The rooms were built for young people, small chairs and low tables and ceilings close enough that I could touch them standing up. Every wall surface was covered with paper that children had attached, drawings made with instruments that left bright marks in the colors of things that were not the war outside. Circles with lines extending from them like light rays, groups of small figures with round heads and arms reaching toward each other. The figures were always in groups. I stood in front of those walls for longer than the mission required me to stand anywhere. Soreth came and stood beside me. He said, "Do not put them in the official report." I said, "They are already in my file." He did not argue. He looked at the drawings for another moment and then walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room, looking at the street below. I photographed every drawing on every wall. I added them to the human baseline file under a section I titled, "What They Are Protecting." On day 4, we crossed an open public square to reach a new sector and encountered a single human in an elevated position in a building overlooking the crossing. He was alone. The position had good coverage and very limited exit options, which meant he had not chosen it for its survivability. He had chosen it for what it could do to us, before the exit options became relevant. It cost us more than the numbers of one person in one position should have cost. When the engagement ended, he had accepted the outcome that had been available to him mathematically from the moment he climbed to that position, and he had accepted it the way all of them seemed to accept outcomes, which was without any apparent surprise. I sat in the rubble of the square afterward, and I tried to write an entry and could not. Soreth sat down next to me. He said, "How many of these have you watched since we landed?" I said, "All of them." He said, "And you still cannot explain it." I said, "Can you?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I understood it on my third mission. Different species, much smaller scale, the same thing." I said, "What did you do with that understanding?" He said, "I filed accurate reports." I said, "Did anyone at command read them?" He looked at me for a moment. Then he stood up and walked away. I added to the human baseline file. Entry 29. He was alone, and he knew the numbers, and he went to that position anyway. I have been using the word courage for what I observe in this species, because it is the closest word I have. Courage is what you demonstrate when you are afraid, and you act in spite of it. What I am watching does not appear to require overcoming anything. They move toward the difficult thing with the ease of people who have already made their peace with the cost. The fear, if it is there, is not what I expected fear to look like. I stopped. I added a second line. I think the fear might be the engine, not the obstacle. I closed the entry. I kept moving. The city breathed around us. The music transmissions on civilian frequencies continued without interruption. I was getting close to the thing I was trying to name. On the last evening before we received extraction orders, 3 humans held a barricade at the end of a narrow street that we needed to pass through. One of them looked at me specifically when we arrived. Not at the soldiers. At me, the one holding the data pad and the recording equipment. She looked at me and said, "You look frightened." I ran my diagnostic. Biological indicators within normal parameters. No detected fear response. She said it again, softer, certain. "You look frightened." Then the engagement began, and when it ended she was gone, and I was standing at the edge of what remained of the barricade, and I added one word to the human baseline file. Entry 44, Scene. I stood there for a while after writing it, holding the data pad, not yet ready to move, the word sitting on the screen, the way the word manageable had once sat circled in my earliest notes. 2 words, both short, both written without fully understanding their weight at the moment of writing them. I had a feeling that the gap between writing a word and understanding it was going to define the rest of this mission, and possibly the rest of however long I would carry what I had learned here. Soreth called for the team to move. I closed the file and followed. The revised threat assessment took me 6 hours to write. I began it the morning after the barricade, in a building whose upper floors had been partially destroyed, and whose lower rooms were intact enough to provide cover. Rain came through the gaps in the structure at regular intervals, which I had learned was a reliable pattern with this planet. It rained every afternoon. The planet kept its schedule regardless of what was happening on its surface. I opened a new document and titled it, Revised Assessment, Earth Prime Contact Event. I started with the sentence, "The initial threat classification was incorrect," and the error was not one of data collection, but of interpretive framework. That was the easiest sentence. What followed was 31 pages of the harder things. The assessment covered every engagement the ground team had participated in since landing, cross-referenced with the orbital observation data I had collected before the fleet arrived, organized by a principle that I had not been using in my earlier reports, which was this: I was no longer documenting what the humans did. I was documenting the decisions that produced what they did. The decision to cross the water channel that the models classified as impassable. The decision to hold the square with one person in a position with no exit. The decision to use a broken vehicle as a deliberate misdirection. The decision, at the barricade, to remain at a post that everyone present understood was going to cost them everything they had brought to it. Decisions have structure. The structure reveals the underlying logic. The underlying logic of every human decision I had documented was consistent in a way that none of my frameworks had prepared me for, and the consistency was this: they were not calculating whether they would survive, they were calculating what the survival was for. And when the second calculation returned a value they considered sufficient, the first calculation became secondary. They were not fighting because they thought they would live. They were fighting because they had decided what they were living for was worth fighting for regardless. I included the music transmissions in the assessment. I knew this section would be flagged by whoever reviewed the report, and I included it anyway because it was accurate data, and because excluding accurate data to avoid editorial friction was the kind of thing that had produced the initial 6-page summary. The transmissions had continued on civilian frequencies throughout the entire engagement without interruption. Music about specific named people in specific named places. Music about weather and seasons and food and things that had nothing to do with military operations. Music about missing someone who was somewhere else. 41 distinct transmission sources documented across 9 days of ground observation, broadcasting content that was personal rather than operational, as if the individuals operating those transmitters had decided that maintaining the broadcast was as important to their mission as anything else they were doing. I recorded and cataloged all of it. I included a representative sample as an appendix. I included the drawings. I included the documentation of objects left outside doorways when people evacuated. Not their valuable objects, not their functional objects. The objects that someone had specifically chosen to leave in a specific visible spot as a specific message to anyone who came after. I had been photographing these since the first day in the city, and I had 72 photographs of 72 separate arrangements, and none of the arrangements contained anything my instruments could assign monetary or utility value to. Small items, chosen for meaning, not worth. I wrote about the school and what was on its walls. The final section of the assessment was a recommendation. It was 2 words long. I wrote them, looked at them for a while, and transmitted the document to Fleet Command. The response came back in 11 minutes. 4 words: maintain current operational posture. 11 minutes was not enough time to read 31 pages carefully. 11 minutes was enough time to read the first page and the subject line and issue a response based on those. I set down the data pad. I looked at the rain coming through the gap in the roof, falling in at the same time it always came, indifferent to everything below it. I picked up the data pad. I found the function in the mission interface that reported the ground team's position to the fleet's tactical network. The function ran automatically, updating every 6 minutes, a routine data feed that I had been maintaining without thinking about it since the moment we landed. I turned it off. No announcement, no message to Sorath or to Fleet Command. I simply stopped running the update. The way you stop doing something when doing it has become a thing you cannot do honestly without examining what you are doing it for. I sat in the damaged building with the rain coming through the ceiling, and I opened the human baseline file. Entry 51. Fleet Command responded to a 31-page revised assessment in 11 minutes. The response was 4 words. I have discontinued the position feed for the ground team. I cannot explain this decision in operational terms. I can explain it in the terms I have been developing in this file for 9 days, which are: the woman at the barricade named what she saw in me, and continuing to function as a targeting asset while calling myself an observer has become a form of dishonesty I am unable to continue practicing. I saved the file. I added entry 52. Entry 52. I think I understand something now. I am not certain I can say it correctly yet, but I am getting close. On the 8th day of the ground operation, we moved through a sector of the city that had been abandoned earlier than the surrounding areas. The buildings here were older, and the streets were narrower, and there were more of the deliberate arrangements outside doorways. Whatever this part of the city meant to the people who had lived in it, they had taken longer to leave it, and had left more of themselves behind. Sorath stopped at a building whose ground floor was still intact and signaled for a rest period. Inside, the rooms were full of objects that people had not taken and had not damaged and had not moved randomly. Someone had organized them. Shelves arranged by some logic I could not immediately read. Containers stacked with care. A stack of flat printed materials, the kind the humans used to transmit images and text, piled precisely rather than scattered. I went through 3 of the printed materials before I understood what I was looking at. Because they were from different periods of the species' history, decades apart, different technologies, different visual styles, different languages in some cases. But the content had a common structure, records of things that had happened, not official records, personal ones, collections of images and written accounts that someone had maintained over a long period, preserving the texture of daily life, the names of people, the specific quality of specific days. Someone had been keeping a record of ordinary things because they understood that ordinary things do not keep themselves. I added entry 53 and it was 3 pages long. Entry 53, condensed. They preserve things. Not because the things are functionally valuable, because the things are true. They document the texture of their experience because they understand, on some level that operates below rational planning, that the experience of being alive is something that has to be actively maintained against the tendency of time to erase it. The objects outside the doorways, the drawings on the school walls, the music transmissions, the personal records in this room, all of it is the same impulse. We were here, and it mattered, and we are going to say so clearly enough that it cannot be mistaken for nothing. I looked at that entry for a long time. Then I added one more line. I do not think we have ever encountered a species that fights for the right to be remembered. I think that might be what we are looking at. On day 9, the ground team had an operation in a commercial district where 3 human units were coordinating a response to our movement through the sector. The coordination was sophisticated in a way that surprised Sorath, and Sorath did not surprise easily. The 3 units were operating as if they shared real-time information about our position without using the communication channels we were monitoring. They were not using any channel we were monitoring. We found out later, through a captured communications device, that they had established a relay system using modified personal equipment that broadcast on a frequency range we had not thought to scan, because the frequency range was associated with a type of technology we had assessed as non-tactical. They had repurposed something we thought was irrelevant. This was the 3rd time in 9 days they had repurposed something we thought was irrelevant. The agricultural platforms in orbit, the vehicle at the first barricade that we had read as damaged and harmless. Now this. There was a pattern in the repurposing that I had been documenting without connecting into a single observation, and on day 9 I finally connected it. Entry 59. They do not accept the categories they are handed. When we classified something as low yield or non-functional or irrelevant, we were making a classification based on our understanding of what that thing was designed for. They were making an assessment based on what that thing could be made to do. These are not the same analysis. Our analysis is faster and more reliable within its own domain. Their analysis produces outcomes that our analysis cannot predict, because their analysis does not start from the same assumptions about what things are for. I saved that entry and went back to the operational data. On day 10, there was a development I recorded in real time and returned to many times afterward. We were moving through a block of residential structures when we encountered a human woman who was alone, not in a defensive position, not armed in any obvious way, sitting on the front step of a damaged building. She was elderly by the species standards, which I had learned to read from their physical presentation. She was holding something in both hands. When we came closer, I could see it was a small container of a type the species used for drinking hot liquids. Sorath signaled caution, standard protocol for civilians in uncertain situations. The woman looked at the team, looked at me specifically with the datapad, and said something that my translator caught as, "I wondered when someone would come by to write things down." Sorath started to move us forward. I held my position for a moment. I said, "You knew we were coming?" She said, "We have known something like you was coming since before I was born. We just did not know when." I said, "That does not frighten you?" She looked at me for a moment. She said, "Frightened is not the same as stopped." Sorath moved us forward and I went with the team, and I added entry 60 to the human baseline file while walking. Entry 60. Frightened is not the same as stopped. I have 9 days of documentation that is a record of that sentence being true in practice. I have been trying to name what I observe in this species for 9 days. She named it in 5 words. Entry 61, which I added 30 seconds later. I wonder if that is what I look like to them. Something that came to observe, but forgot that observing is also a choice. On day 11, we received word that the fleet was initiating what the official communication called a redeployment to address expanded operational priorities. The language was careful and indirect, and what it meant was that what had started above Earth had become something larger than Earth, that the pattern we had encountered here was not isolated to this contact event, that the fleet needed to consolidate. The word withdrawal did not appear in the communication. I added entry 62. The fleet is leaving. Earth is not the only planet doing this. I have been writing a file called Human Baseline, and I have been thinking of it as a document about one species. It may be a document about something larger than one species. It may be a document about a category of thing that the Dominion has been encountering without recognizing it, because recognizing it would require a framework we have not built, because building it would require acknowledging that we removed something from ourselves that we should not have removed. I did not transmit that entry to anyone. I saved it to the file and kept moving. On day 7, between the message about the woman on the front step and the announcement of the fleet's redeployment, there was an engagement I have not yet described because I did not know, at the time, how to file it under any category in the human baseline structure I had been using. We were moving to relieve pressure on a forward observation point that had been holding a position longer than its supply allowance suggested it should. When we arrived, the position was not under siege in the way the reports had suggested. It had been quiet for nearly 6 hours. The human unit that had been holding it was gone. Having relocated under cover of darkness to a secondary position they had clearly prepared in advance, leaving behind a series of deliberately staged decoys designed to keep our sensors reading activity in a location that had already been abandoned. It was a clean withdrawal, disciplined, executed without panic, and without the kind of disorganized retreat the behavioral models would have predicted from a unit that had been under sustained pressure for as long as this one had. Sorath examined the decoys with something that, on a human face, I would have read as professional admiration. He did not say this directly. He said, "This is not what running away looks like." I said, "What does running away look like?" He said, "I have seen it. Species, individuals, units. It looks like discarded equipment and broken formation and people moving in directions that do not make tactical sense because the only thing driving the movement is the impulse to be somewhere else. This was not that. This was a planned relocation that happened to look, from a distance, like a retreat." I added entry 48 to the human baseline file. There is a difference between leaving a position because you have been broken and leaving a position because staying no longer served the purpose the position was meant to serve. I am not certain our combat models distinguish between these two things. I am becoming increasingly certain that this distinction is the single most important variable in predicting what this species will do next, and that we have been measuring everything except this. We continued through the abandoned position, cataloging what had been left behind. Among the decoys, In a structure that had clearly served as a command point, there was a hand-drawn map. Not a tactical map in the sense the Dominion would use the term. It showed the position, the surrounding terrain, and a series of annotations in the margins that my translator struggled to render precisely because the annotations were not operational notes. They were names. Besides several of the marked locations on the map, someone had written the name of a person, as though the map was not only a record of terrain, but a record of who had stood where, who had done what, who needed to be remembered as having been present at this specific point during this specific defense. I photographed the map and added it to the file under the same heading I had used for the drawings in the school: what they are protecting. This was the moment, more than any single engagement before it, when I understood that the distinction between a tactical record and a memorial record did not exist for this species in the way it existed for the Dominion. Every act of defense was simultaneously an act of documentation. They fought, and they remembered fighting in the same motion, as though the two things could not be separated without losing something essential to both. I sat with the map for a long time before we moved on. On day 12, the extraction orders came through. I had 2 hours. I used the first 40 minutes going back through the human baseline file from entry 1 and reading everything I had written across 12 days of contact with a species the briefing had summarized in 6 pages. 78 entries, 104 pages. I added entry 79 on the last page. Entry 79. The file says they are manageable. The file I have been building for 12 days is a record of everything that word fails to account for. I am going to keep both files. I am going to transmit the accurate one to a shelf where it will sit until someone is ready to look at it. And I am going to remember that somewhere on a planet that received a visit from 17 cruisers and 4 words of contact offer, the music transmissions are still running on civilian frequencies, and someone in a damaged building has a stack of personal records that they organized carefully before they left. And on the walls of a school where children used to learn things, there are drawings of people standing together with their arms extended toward each other, and none of those figures in any of those drawings is standing alone. I saved the file. I packed my equipment. I walked to the extraction point in the rain. Sorath was already there. He looked at my data pad and did not say anything about the size of the file or the time I had spent on it. He said, "Ready?" I said, "Yes." The transport lifted us out. The city fell away below and became a pattern again, the way things become patterns when you get far enough from them. And I watched it get smaller and smaller through the transport window, and I thought about the difference between the outline of things and the weight of things, and how orbit shows you one and the ground shows you the other, and how the distance between those two views is exactly the distance between the briefing that lasted 11 minutes and the file that was now 104 pages long. The Dominion vessel was clean. I noticed this immediately when the transport locked into the main ship and the ramp sealed. The air was calibrated to the correct temperature and composition. The lighting was precisely within the range designated as optimal for Dominion biology. The hallways were the right width and the right length, and every surface was the right surface. Everything was what it was supposed to be. I stood in the corridor outside my assigned quarters and felt, for a reason I was only beginning to understand, that this correctness was a kind of absence. Earth had been wrong in every direction at once. The air wrong, the sounds wrong, the smell wrong, the scale of things wrong, the light filtered through an atmosphere that was too thick, and the wrong color at the edges of the day. Wrong in the way that something is wrong when it was not built for you specifically, when it grew into the shape it has through its own logic rather than through a process of deliberate optimization. And yet the wrongness had felt, by the end of 12 days inside it, like information. Like the planet was constantly transmitting something through every one of those mismatches, something that the Dominion ship, with its perfect calibration, had nothing to transmit. I went into my quarters and set down my equipment and opened the human baseline file. 104 pages. I sat with it for a while without adding anything, just sitting with what I had built across 12 days of contact with a species that 6 pages had not been enough to describe. The debrief was the following morning. I had been assigned to the fleet's primary evaluation officer, a woman named Lena Marsh, who had been conducting post-contact assessments for 11 years. She was precise, professional, and had the particular quality of attention that comes from doing important work for a long time without losing interest in it. She reviewed my biological indicators and cognitive performance metrics and told me the results were consistent with normal post-contact stress responses and that I would normalize within 2 standard cycles. I said, yes. She said, your documentation was thorough. I said, thank you. She said, the human baseline file has been flagged for supplementary review. Supplementary review was a specific designation in the Dominion's documentation system. It meant too large to dismiss outright, too complex to integrate into the current operational framework, placed on a dedicated archive channel where it would be available to analysts conducting longer-term research. It meant the file was going onto a shelf. I said, which sections of the standard report were incorporated into the fleet summary? She looked at her display. She said, the engagement data and tactical assessments, the sections on population movement and infrastructure status. I said, and the other sections? She said, supplementary review. The music transmissions were supplementary review. The drawings were supplementary review. The objects outside the doorways and the personal records in the organized building and the woman on the front step who had said frightened is not the same as stopped were all supplementary review. I thanked Lena Marsh for her time and returned to my quarters. I opened the human baseline file. I added page 105. Page 105 began with a question. The question was, what is fear actually for? 300 years ago, the Dominion made a decision about fear that had been reviewed and confirmed and cited and built upon across every subsequent generation of Dominion development. The evidence for the decision was substantial. The logic was sound. Fear impedes processing efficiency. Fear introduces hesitation into decision pathways at precisely the moments when rapid decision-making is most critical. Fear is a biological legacy, a response developed for an environmental context that no longer exists, for a species that has achieved the Dominion's level of technological and social development. It is a holdover, an inefficiency. Remove it, and the organism performs better across every measurable domain. 300 years of data confirmed this was correct. And yet, I had spent 12 days watching a species that had all of it. Every gram of the unmodified, unreviewed, completely intact biological fear response, the version with the elevated pulse and the constricted peripheral vision, and the full and unfiltered experience of understanding exactly how bad the situation is, and being unable to make the understanding smaller by having it. They had all of it. They walked straight into the thing that caused it, every time, not despite the fear, not around it, or after overcoming it, or through some individual act of will that suppressed it long enough to act. They walked into it with it. As if the fear and the action were not in opposition, as if the fear was part of the action, or the reason for it, or the engine driving it, rather than the friction slowing it down. I sat with the question for a long time. Then I started writing the answer. Fear is not what breaks you, I wrote. Fear is the accurate measurement of what is at stake. I stopped there and read that sentence. I wrote, the bigger the fear, the more clearly the organism understands the value of what it stands to lose. The fear is not interference in the calculation. The fear is the calculation. The humans at every engagement I documented were not acting in spite of their fear. They were acting because their fear was accurately reporting to them that the thing on the other side of the action was worth the cost of the action. I stopped again. I wrote, we removed the mechanism that tells you something is worth it. I read that sentence 3 times. I wrote, we called the removal an improvement. It was across every metric we applied to measure it. And the metrics we applied were chosen by a civilization that had already removed the mechanism those metrics would have been designed to measure. So the metrics we chose were the ones that made sense after the removal, which means we were measuring improvement from within the improved state and calling it objective, which is not what objective means. This was the longest entry in the human baseline file. I wrote for 3 hours. I was in the middle of writing it when I heard the conversation in the corridor. Two members of the fleet's strategic assessment team. I recognized one voice from a briefing I had attended before the mission. They were discussing the next contact event on the Dominion's expansion calendar. A species in a smaller system, they said. Low technology index. No faster-than-light capability. Minimal military infrastructure. They were using the standard pre-contact vocabulary, the phrases that the assessment template provided for species below certain technological thresholds. One of them said, "The projection is straightforward, should be manageable." I sat in my quarters with the human baseline file open and the word manageable coming through the wall from the corridor, and I did not say anything. I finished writing the entry. I titled it, "What Fear is For." Then I opened a new file. I named it Pre-Contact Notes, Next Assignment. On the first line, in the space where the threat classification would normally go, I wrote, "Before writing the threat classification, spend 12 days on the ground." On the second line I wrote, "Do not make threat classifications from orbit. Orbit shows you the outline. The ground shows you the weight. These are not interchangeable kinds of knowledge." On the third line I wrote, "They mounted weapons on agricultural research equipment. Note this not as a threat capability assessment, but as a statement about the nature of the species. A species that mounts weapons on equipment designed for growing food in zero gravity is telling you something specific about how it solves problems. Listen to what it is saying." I saved the file. I returned to the human baseline file. I added entry 82. Entry 82. There is a fleet officer in the corridor discussing the next contact event. He said should be manageable in the same tone the briefing officer used to describe this mission. I wrote the word manageable in my notes at the beginning of this mission, and I circled it, and I could not tell you at the time why I circled it. I can tell you now. I circled it because the word contains an assumption about the thing being described, and assumptions are the first place where accurate observation fails. Should be manageable is not a description of a species. It is a description of how much the speaker has chosen to look at the species. The looking is the variable. The looking is always the variable. Entry 83, added immediately after. The mission I just completed began with a 6-page summary and ended with 107 pages of documentation. The species the 6-page summary described and the species the 107 pages describe are not recognizably the same thing. Not because the species changed, because the looking did. On the 4th day after extraction, I received a communication through the ship's internal relay. It was from a member of the ground team named Clara Finch, who had been the team's field medic. She had been on 3 previous contact missions and had said very little to me during the 12 days of ground operation, but she had been present at a number of the engagements I had documented, and I suspected she had been reading my running reports. The communication was brief. It said, "I read the section about the drawings. For what it is worth, you wrote about it correctly. Keep writing accurate reports. The accurate ones are the ones that matter later." I added that message to the human baseline file as entry 84 without commentary. It seemed to contain its own commentary. On the 5th day after extraction, I did something I had not done since before the mission began. I listened. Not to intercepts. Not to operational transmissions. I opened the archive of civilian frequency recordings I had cataloged across 12 days of ground observation, 91 hours of transmissions, and I played them through my audio receiver without translating, without categorizing, without adding them to any analytical framework. I let them come through the way they had come through on those frequencies from inside the city, layered and inconsistent and occasionally overlapping, carrying the specific voices of specific people talking about specific things in the specific way that things are talked about by people who are not performing for anyone. I listened for 4 hours. I did not add an entry for those 4 hours. Some things do not need to be documented to be understood. On the 6th day after extraction, I had an unscheduled conversation with a woman named Mia Calloway in the fleet's Xenobiology Research Division. She had accessed the supplementary review archive and read the human baseline file in full. She found me in the ship's observation deck and introduced herself by saying, "You were right about the fear. I have been trying to write that sentence for 3 missions, and the words kept not working, and you found the words." I said I do not know that I found the right words. She said, "You found words closer to right than anything currently in the formal literature, which is not nothing." We talked for 2 hours. She told me she had documented similar behavioral patterns in 3 previous contact events. Not identical, similar, the same underlying logic operating at different scales and in different contexts. I said, "What happened with those contact events?" She said, "We completed them, eventually." I said, "And the documentation?" She said, "Supplementary review." I said, "All of it?" She said, "All of it? But someone found it later. Someone always finds it later, when the same pattern appears in a new event, and the assessment officers need to understand why the projections did not hold." She said, "The shelf is not nothing. Write for the shelf. The shelf is read more often than you think, and more carefully." I added entry 88 after she left. Entry 88. There are others. This is not the only contact event where the pattern has appeared. The shelf has files from 3 previous events describing the same underlying thing. Nobody connected them at the time. The connections might be made now, with one more file added, and the pattern clearer. Or they might not. Either way, the accurate record exists. The accurate record is the job. On the 7th day after extraction, I went back to the beginning of the human baseline file and read it from entry 1. Then I closed it. Then I opened the pre-contact notes file for the next assignment. I added a 4th line. The 4th line said, "When you find what they are protecting, write it down before you write anything else. The things they are protecting are the document. Everything else is context." I saved the file. I looked at the wall of my calibrated quarters. Somewhere behind the wall, the ship moved through space with the efficiency of a civilization that had been optimizing itself for 3 centuries. I thought about what optimization looks like from the inside. I thought about what it costs. I thought about the woman on the front step with the hot drink who had said frightened is not the same as stopped. I thought about the pilot whose last transmission was an accounting entry. I thought about a word that had been circled in my notes on the first day of a mission, that the briefing had summarized in 11 minutes. I thought about how long the word had been waiting to be understood. Not long enough. Not yet. But we were getting closer. In the days that followed, before the next assignment formally began, I returned to the corridor where I had overheard the 2 officers discussing the smaller, quieter species waiting somewhere in the next sector. I did not approach them. I did not correct them. I understood by then that correcting them would accomplish nothing, because the correction they needed was not a sentence I could hand them in passing. It was an experience. 12 days of one, specifically, the kind that cannot be summarized into a briefing without losing the very thing that made it true. I thought instead about what it would mean to be the kind of analyst who carried that experience forward quietly, embedding it into every report rather than announcing it, letting the accumulated weight of careful observation do the work that a single argument never could. That felt, in the end, like the only honest path available to me. I closed my eyes in the calibrated stillness of my quarters and let the ship's engines hum beneath me, and for the first time since boarding, the sound did not feel like silence pretending to be peace. It felt like waiting, the good kind, the kind that comes before you finally understand something you have been circling for a very long time. The days following extraction settled into a rhythm I did not expect, which was the rhythm of a person trying to live inside 2 different timelines at once. One timeline was the ship, calibrated, scheduled, optimized, moving through space with the smooth efficiency of a civilization that had spent 300 years removing every source of friction from its own operation. Meals at fixed intervals, sleep cycles regulated by ambient lighting adjustments, conversations that followed predictable patterns because everyone on board had been trained, in one way or another, to communicate efficiently. The other timeline was the one still running in my head, 12 days long, made of rain that arrived on schedule, and drawings that survived in colors that should not have lasted, and a woman on a front step who said 5 words that explained more about an entire species than anything in my training had prepared me to understand. I lived in both timelines simultaneously, and I was discovering that this was not something you stopped doing once the mission ended. It was something you carried forward. I had been changed. This was the conclusion I kept arriving at whenever I tried to account for the difference between the scout, who had written the word manageable on the first day, and the one sitting in a calibrated room 3 weeks later, unable to locate any single moment where the change had occurred. There was no incident I could point to, no specific revelation. The change had accumulated the way the rain had accumulated through the gap in the school roof, one entry at a time, one observation at a time, until the cumulative weight of it had become a permanent feature of who I was, rather than a temporary reaction to circumstances. I spent the first several days after my conversation with Mia Calloway reviewing the human baseline file from the beginning, slowly, reading every entry the way you reread something important when you are trying to understand not just what it says, but why you wrote it the way you did. Entry 1 was simple, factual, a scout reporting what the data showed. By entry 44, the entries had a different texture, less data, more meaning. The scout writing them was no longer simply observing. She was trying to understand what the observations were teaching her, and the teaching had begun to outpace the documentation. By entry 107, the final entry I had written before extraction, the file had become something else entirely, not a threat assessment. Not even, strictly speaking, a research document. It had become a record of transformation, both the species being observed and the observer doing the observing, and I was not certain the Dominion had a category for that kind of document, which might be exactly why it had been flagged for supplementary review rather than active use. I added page 108. Page 108 said, "I do not think the Dominion classifies species incorrectly because the data collection methods are flawed. I think we classify species incorrectly because we are measuring with instruments that cannot detect the thing that matters most. We measure technology level, military capability, social cohesion under normal conditions, communication infrastructure. These are real measurements, and they produce real numbers, and the numbers are not wrong. What the numbers fail to capture is what a population is willing to become when everything else has been stripped away. That number does not show up until the stripping away actually happens, which means you cannot measure it from orbit, and you cannot measure it from a 6-page summary, and you can only measure it by being present when the stripping away occurs and writing down, with complete honesty, what you see happen." I read that entry several times. Then I added one more line. "We do not have an instrument for that measurement. We have me. For 12 days, I was the instrument." On the 10th day after extraction, I requested and received access to the Dominion's full archive of supplementary review files related to contact events with what the archive system classified as anomalous resistance patterns. Mia Calloway had mentioned 3 prior events. The archive contained, after I expanded my search parameters beyond the immediate region she had referenced, 7 contact events across 3 centuries where a target species had demonstrated the pattern I had documented on Earth. Increased cohesion under sustained pressure rather than the expected degradation. Adaptive tactical responses that improved in real time rather than following predictable decay curves. The maintenance of cultural and emotional infrastructure, art and music and personal records, even during active conflict, as though the maintenance of those things was itself considered a form of resistance. 7 events, 7 files, all 7 flagged for supplementary review. None of them cross-referenced with each other in the active operational database, because no one had connected them. Each scout who filed each report had been working alone, documenting an anomaly that looked, from inside any single contact event, like a unique and isolated case. It was only from the outside, looking at all 7 together, that the pattern became visible. I spent 2 full days cross-referencing the 7 files against my own. The similarities were not superficial. They were structural. In every case, the target species had demonstrated this pattern specifically when fighting to protect something the analysis described as cultural continuity rather than physical survival. the species were not afraid of dying. They were afraid of being forgotten, of their specific way of being alive disappearing from the universe without a record, without a witness, without anyone left who understood what had been lost. Fear, in every one of these 7 cases, had not been a response to death. It had been a response to erasure. I added this to the human baseline file as entry 112, and for the first time since beginning the file, I felt that I had found something that was not just true about Earth. I had found something that might be true about the underlying nature of resistance itself, wherever it occurred, whatever species was doing the resisting. The mechanism the Dominion removed 3 centuries ago was not simply the fear response. It was the specific capacity to feel, with full physiological force, the weight of what continuity means and what its absence would cost. We had removed our own fear of being forgotten, and in removing it, we had also removed whatever it was that made other species fight so hard against being forgotten by us. We did not just remove our own fear. We made ourselves the thing that produces fear in others, without remembering what it felt like to need to fight against disappearing. This was the largest entry I had ever written in the file, and it took me the better part of an entire day, and when I finished it, I sat in the silence of my quarters and did not move for a long time. On the 13th day after extraction, I received formal notice that my next assignment had been finalized. A species in a system 3 sectors away, designated for preliminary observation ahead of a possible contact event in approximately 1 Dominion cycle. The species was, according to the 6-page summary I was provided, technologically primitive and socially fragmented, with no indication of coordinated resistance capability. I read the 6 pages twice. I thought about another 6-page summary, written about a different planet, that had also concluded with the word manageable. Before I packed for departure, I spent an additional 2 days doing something that was not part of my official preparation schedule. I went back through every prior Dominion contact file I could access, not just the 7 flagged for anomalous resistance, but the routine ones, the successful pacifications, the missions that had gone exactly as projected, with no surprises and no complications. There were over 200 of these in the accessible archive, spanning the full 3 centuries since the fear removal initiative had been implemented. I was looking for something specific, though I did not fully understand what until I found it. In every successful, uncomplicated pacification, the target species had one thing in common that I had not previously thought to measure. Within the first generation of Dominion contact, every one of them had stopped producing what the archive classified, in a dry administrative phrase, as non-utilitarian cultural artifacts. Art. Music outside of ceremonial function. Personal record-keeping that served no operational purpose. The behavior simply tapered off and then stopped, generation by generation, replaced by the more efficient communication and behavioral patterns the Dominion considered markers of successful integration. I sat with that data for a long time. It was not that the Dominion had destroyed these things directly, in most cases. It was that contact with the Dominion, and the slow absorption into Dominion operational culture that followed, made those things seem increasingly impractical, increasingly costly, increasingly beside the point. The species adapted, they optimized. They became generation after generation more like us. And in becoming more like us, they had stopped doing the thing that, on Earth, I had watched an entire species do under conditions of total external pressure, maintain the specific, ungovernable, inefficient parts of themselves precisely because those parts were the reason anything else was worth defending. I added this to the human baseline file as entry 113. Entry 113. I do not think pacification is something the Dominion does to a species in a single violent event. I think pacification is something that continues quietly for generations afterward, in the slow erosion of everything a 6-page summary would never think to measure. Earth resisted the violent version for 12 days in a way that nearly cost the fleet a meaningful percentage of its operational capacity. I do not know if Earth, or any species like it, can resist the slow version. I do not know if anyone has ever tried to measure whether they need to. I added entry 114 immediately after, shorter, almost an afterthought, though it turned out to be the entry I returned to most often in the weeks that followed. Entry 114. If I am ever assigned to a pacified world, years after contact, I am going to look for the drawings on the walls. If I do not find any, that will be the most important data point in the report. I packed my equipment for the new assignment with a different kind of attention than I had brought to the Earth mission. Where I had once packed instruments designed to measure capability, I now packed instruments designed to measure something else, something I did not yet have a clean name for but which I was beginning to think of, in my own private vocabulary, as the weight of continuity. In the final days before departure I returned, more than once, to the audio archive of the civilian transmissions, letting the music play in the background while I prepared my equipment and reviewed my notes, not because I needed to hear it again, but because some part of me had started to treat the sound as a kind of company. It did not feel strange anymore to sit in a calibrated Dominion room and let a species I had never been built to understand fill the silence with something that was unmistakably, stubbornly, theirs. I thought more than once about the researcher who had read my file and told me the shelf was read more carefully than I assumed. I thought about whether that was a kindness or simply the truth, and decided it did not matter which, because either way it meant the work was not wasted, even if it took years before anyone acted on it. On my last full day aboard the fleet vessel, Sorath found me in the observation deck. We had not spoken since the extraction. He stood beside me for a while without saying anything, looking out at the same field of stars I had been looking at. Eventually he said, "I read the whole file, all 115 pages. I said, "I did not know that." He said, "Most people will not. I wanted you to know that at least one person did, start to finish, not just the sections flagged as relevant." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Do not thank me. Just keep writing them." He left before I could respond, and I stood there for a while longer, watching the stars, thinking about how many conversations like that one might be happening quietly across the fleet. Conversations that never made it into any official record. Conversations that were themselves a small private rebellion against the very efficiency that had produced them. Before departure, I made one final addition to the human baseline file. Entry 115, the last entry, written the night before I left the ship that had carried me away from Earth. It said, "I do not know what happened to the city after we left. I do not know if the music transmissions are still running on civilian frequencies. I do not know if the rain still comes through the gap in the school roof at the same hour every afternoon, or if the drawings on the walls have survived another season of exposure, or if the woman on the front step is still sitting there with her hot drink, watching for whoever comes next. I know that for 12 days I was given the rare and uncomfortable privilege of watching a species refuse to be reduced to the word a 6-page summary had assigned to them. I know that the word manageable, the word I circled on the first day without understanding why, turned out to be the least accurate word available for describing what I witnessed. I know that fear, the thing my species spent 3 centuries removing from itself in the name of efficiency, turned out to be the exact mechanism that explained everything I could not otherwise explain about why a species with no faster-than-light capability and no orbital weapons of meaningful yield fought 17 cruisers to something other than total submission. I know that I am carrying something back that does not fit cleanly into any Dominion classification system, and that the classification systems are not going to change quickly enough to make room for it, and that the file is going to sit in supplementary review next to 7 other files describing the same unrecognized pattern, waiting for someone with the right kind of attention to notice that 8 is not a coincidence. I know that I am going to keep writing these files anyway. I know that somewhere behind me, getting smaller with every cycle the ship travels forward, there is a planet that taught me more about what fear is actually for than 3 centuries of Dominion research ever did, and that the lesson did not arrive as a briefing or a report or a 6-page summary. It arrived as a woman looking directly at me and naming, with complete and unflinching accuracy, the thing I had not yet found the courage to name myself. "You look frightened." I did. I still do, in the particular way I have come to understand fear now, which is not as weakness and not as malfunction, but as the clearest evidence available that something out there is worth being afraid of losing. I had, before sealing the file, opened the pre-contact notes document one final time and added a fifth line beneath the four I had already written. The fifth line said, "This species has not yet been stripped of anything. You do not know yet what it is protecting, because nothing has tried to take it away. Do not mistake the absence of visible resistance for the absence of something worth resisting for. Find out what they would fight to keep before you decide what they will not fight for." I am taking that understanding to the next assignment. I do not know yet what I will find there, but I know now to look for the thing they are protecting before I write any word that claims to summarize what they are. I know now that the word manageable is not a conclusion. It is a warning sign that the looking has not gone deep enough yet. I am going to look deeper this time. I owe that much to the planet that taught me, the hard way, exactly what I had been missing. The transport carrying me to the next assignment pulled away from the larger fleet vessel just before dawn by the ship's internal clock, and as it did, I opened the audio archive one final time and let a few minutes of the recorded music play through the cabin before the long silence of the journey ahead replaced it. It felt, in some way I could not fully explain even to myself, like carrying a small piece of Earth forward into whatever came next, not as a souvenir, as a compass. End of file. Saved. Filed for the record, whether or not anyone reads it yet.